Welcome to Generations, a show which helps people 50 and better lead happy, healthy, and productive lives. Moderated today by Nadia Giordana.
Welcome to Generations, the Roundtable Edition. I'm Nadia Giordana, and off to my side here is Karen Riesett,
Hi, Nadia.
co-hosting. Hi, Karen. Nice to have you here today.
It's wonderful to be back again.
Absolutely. And Ellie Fried.
Hi, Nadia. I'm very excited to be here. I love storytelling.
I know, it's going to be fun today. And Diane Winkler.
Oh, and I love the pictures in this book.
Mm-hmm.
They individually tell a story.
Oh, I
It's
know.
just
I can't wait to get to
wonderful.
that.
I'm excited.
And our guest today, Carol McCormick, is a professional storyteller. And Carol, tell us a little bit about what that means and what you do within the community.
Well, we're all storytellers. It's just I get paid to tell stories. And I work with all ages, from preschool to senior citizen. And the purpose of my work is discovery learning. I want to be a wise old woman. So I thought if I tell a lot of stories that have stood the test of time, I'm going to learn something as I'm sharing those stories. And I think that's the way that we become more of a peaceful planet, and people learn to get along. They say if you know someone's story, it's very hard to hate them.
How long have you been doing this?
It's been over 30 years now. Yeah.
Did you start with your family?
You know, families are a tough audience. But one time my brother said, you know, your dad's a storyteller. So I think I've been telling stories all my life because I love to talk. And I got into it, I was teaching. And when I moved to Minnesota, there weren't teaching jobs. I'd been out for a number of years raising children. And I substituted for 3 years, and I used storytelling then because I would bribe the kids. I'd tell a story first and say, if we work hard, we'll have another story, you know, before lunch.
Good idea.
If we get all the work done, we can have storytelling all the rest of the afternoon. So, and then I just took the step, I took a sales job, so it involved some travel, selling communications skills courses, and then I could build up my client list so that I could go full-time.
I think, and especially within the framework of teaching, that was probably one of the places where you may have honed that skill even more.
Definitely. When I was in graduate school and was doing case studies, I discovered the story is the smallest unit of meaning. People remember it. It joins both the head and the heart. And so it stays in our subconscious. And then when we're in a parallel situation, that story will come back to us.
Oh, I didn't even have an idea about that.
Yes, and my first teaching job was literally on the wrong side of the tracks in Texas. It was the last year of the Supreme Court decision, and they had to integrate. And all but 3 of the black teachers were fired. And so a bunch of us student-wise, my husband was in graduate school at the time, would travel 30 miles from the university town to teach at this school. And they departmentalized. This was before departmentalizing was in. I was teaching science and social studies in 4th grade, but my science textbook was 10 years old. So I used storytelling because there was no money for experiments and materials and things to tell the story, and it was as if the kids had done the experiments. And then they could make their hypothesis and their theories.
Wow.
The same way with the social studies. The social studies text was 10 years old. So I would tell stories about a country, and then it was as if they were experiencing it, and it really worked.
It makes it more personal, doesn't it?
Yes.
Were a lot of the students African-American students?
Maybe half and half.
Half and half. So it was integrated.
It was integrated. What was sad, I had grown up in the suburbs of Chicago, so it was integrated. And when down south, they spent all summer fixing up that school to make it good enough for the white students to come. And my colleague, who was black and had taught for 10 years and had a master's, and I was right out of the University of Illinois, very green, you know, I hadn't ever had a classroom of my own. They gave her health and homeroom, and also a study hall,
What a waste.
because they were worried about some of the parents complaining about having her for a teacher. But she was a very good teacher.
Wow.
I think we do remember our own past history through stories,
Oh, yes.
too. And, you know, I just thinking when Ellie and I were talking about storytelling, about some things in my family that I remember so well and I'm so fond of. And one was that my grandparents, who were real adventuresome people, took their 4 kids in the Model T Ford up to Duluth. It was a big trip from St. Paul. All 4 kids in the back. My grandfather was a very stubborn German man, and my grandmother was her Norwegian self, and off they went. Well, they went to the lift bridge in Duluth, and my grandfather got in the wrong lane and went up to go over that bridge, and part of the bridge lifted as they were going. And of course, all the bells and whistles went off and everything. Well, by this time, my mother was in the back seat, she tells me, weeping. And my uncle, who was the littlest of the family, was on the floor praying. And I think, you know, that's such a treasured and fond memory of my family, some of whom, you know, long gone on, but that I remember fondly because of that story.
I have memories like that too, and I've, you know, worked well with my aunts and uncles. Not so much telling stories to my kids, although I've done that too. But my aunts and uncles told wonderful stories. But you know, when I have a son who's a writer, and he'll say to me, well, those aren't really like stories, they're more like memories. But what's the difference? I have, my one uncle had a cabin up north, and the whole family went up for the summer. He worked, so he went back and forth. But when they closed up for the fall to come home, they packed up the Model T with all their stuff hanging off the top and everything. And he wanted to take a last swim in the lake before he left. So he did that. All the towels were already packed up. So he took an Indian blanket off the couch and wrapped it around him. And he had on his swim trunks, and he always wore white socks and black shoes. And so they're driving home. He's driving. And a policeman stops him because stuff was falling off the car. And he was going to get a ticket for this. And my uncle said, well, I'll have you know I'm a prominent St. Paul attorney. The policeman looked at him and thought, what am I going to do with you in an Indian blanket? So I think it's a great story, but my son calls it a memory. So what's the difference?
I say anything that has a beginning, a middle, and an end is a story,
Okay.
because it's a hologram. And it
Okay.
could be a personal historical story, you
Yeah.
know.
So I should probably find out more
Memoir.
about how that ended.
That would be
You got a
interesting.
ticket.
I suppose a story, he's thinking that a story means fictional. And stories don't necessarily have to be fictional. They can be fictional, but they can also be autobiographical, part of a memoir. And
Well, he did say it, you know, it needs a better ending.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah.
may have to do some research to get an ending
So
for
maybe
that.
the policeman said, I don't care if you're the king of Siam.
You know, too, it's perfectly okay when I'm teaching storytelling to make it up.
I was going to say
Just,
that.
yes, I mean,
Make one
it's,
up.
you know, I say every story I tell is true. It comes from my heart to your heart. But parts of it may not be scientifically correct or historically accurate. Because
That's good. I'd like to hear that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of them I tell are historical, you know,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I have one that I can relate to that World War II era, and I was 3 years old. My father had enlisted, and he and my mother got in the old car they owned and went to San Antonio, Texas, where he would be trained to be a navigator bombardier of a B-29. And so halfway there, flat tire and no money. And so went into a gas station And the gas station owner saw where he was going with his military ID and everything, and said, "Don't worry about the cost of the tire." This was World War II era.
Wow.
And then when we got there, of course, he was very busy in all of his training, and I had a good time. I thought that was kind of fun living, you know, on the base, and there was a swimming pool and all that kind of thing. But then when it was time for him to leave and go overseas, he would fly right from San Antonio to Saipan and be there for the bombing raids that he was part of. Well, that meant my mother and I had to get back to St. Paul. And so that meant, fortunately, there was a neighbor there that was in the transportation department for the Air Force. He got us 2 tickets on the train, and we went from San Antonio first to St. Louis. And there they decided that train needed to change. There was something wrong with it, mechanical, you know. And so they insisted that we stay the night in a hotel next to the train station. Now, I'm about 3.5 by this time. And so my mother made friends with a lady on the train, and we went to probably a flea bag hotel next to the train station. And then I slept in the middle, my mother and this other lady in the one double bed. And we got back on the train, and that was another instance where World War II era came to play, and there was a soldier on it, the train. My mother asked him, because my mother by this time was pregnant with my sister and not feeling well. And so she just couldn't get up and get up to the dining car to get me food. She gave the soldier her whole wallet, everything that she had, and asked, "Will you please get my daughter some food?"
Trust.
And of course he did. Went and got the food, brought it back, and so on. And we made it to St. Paul, Union Depot, and my grandparents met us, and we lived with my grandparents until my dad returned, and my sister was born in St. Paul. So, you know, my mother just passed away about a month ago, and it's just such a wonderful memory of her life, and, you know, how dedicated she was.
Vivid memories make great stories, don't they?
They do.
I think so,
That's a great
yeah,
one of your
yeah.
mother, yeah.
Just shows me how much she cared. I mean, she really protected me during that time, and you know, it was challenging for her. And she was a strong woman, and lived to be 96, and all that strength paid out for her.
Wonderful.
By telling stories of those we love who have passed, we keep their memory alive, loving green, they say. It's honoring them.
Yeah.
And it's so
That's nice.
important for the generation that will never meet them,
Yeah.
you know, to know something about their ancestors.
My great-grandparents from way back during the war between the North and the South, my great-great-grandfather was Robert E. Lee's right-hand man.
How about that?
And they wrote stories about him. He was a major, and everything was going along pretty smooth until he was on his horse and someone shot him off the horse. So they made a kind of a story out of what happened to him. And they did get a hold of some of our family members and said, "We'd like to have you come down. There's books that have been made about your great-great-grandpa." And so we were so excited, we couldn't believe it. We didn't know, and neither did they, that those books do not last. It was just powder.
Oh. But at least you have the portion of the story which you can
Right.
continue to tell. How sad that the books
Because
disintegrated.
they didn't know how to preserve them, had no idea. So we all went home saying, well, we had a nice trip, but it was just something to think that they didn't know how to do like they do now, preserve them.
Well, it takes climate control. You can't
Yeah.
just have a
Yes,
book
that's
on a
right.
shelf.
Yeah.
That's right, yep.
Yes.
Some of my fondest memories are getting together with my parents and my dad's family. He had 11 brothers and sisters, and we didn't all get together at the same time necessarily, but they just told wonderful stories. That same uncle, during the war, after Easter time, the kids had gotten some little chicks for Easter, so he decided that would be a good learning experience for the kids. So they got some more chicks, and he set up an incubator in the basement of the house, and the incubator has to be exhausted. So steam was coming out of the window. So the authorities came one day to find out if he had a still in the basement. And at the same time, they had a pig in the backyard. The kids had to learn about nature and animals. And so every once in a while, this pig would wander away. They lived on Lincoln and Finn in St. Paul. And the pig would wander over to Grand Avenue where there was a streetcar. And when those streetcar tracks were in the sun and got nice and warm, the pig loved to sit on them. So the streetcar conductor would come over periodically and say, Mrs. So-and-so, I'm not going to give her name, but could you please come over and get your pig off the tracks? I have to get the streetcar going. So she'd go over with an apple on a stick and
That's what they like.
See, that's an example of a story that shows a lot about lifestyle
yeah.
at a particular period in time, because you wouldn't imagine pigs or incubators other than in a farm situation today. So that
Right.
brings it right to the forefront that was right in a city.
Yeah, right.
And that's living history.
It
You know,
is.
I've done school residencies where the kids will go visit a senior residence to get, they will interview and get stories, because it creates that bridge between the generations.
Yeah.
And it means more rather than reading in a book. And then it's really important, I think, to record them, if you can, you know, because people die and then they, you know, the stories can be lost.
My dad did that. He recorded all his
Yeah.
brothers and sisters, so we can still listen to their voices. It's
Oh,
fabulous.
yeah, the voice is important. And Carol, why don't you tell us one of your stories?
Okay? So
Okay.
once long ago, there was a wise old woman, and she lived on top of a high hill. If you saw her and you lived then, you might think she was very poor because she had just a little hut for a house and she only had one horse. And every day her son would ride her horse down into the village and he'd work all day, and then in the evening he'd ride home with the dinner that he had earned for them. But that woman felt she was rich because she had many stories. And one day, her son slept too late. Do you remember having teenagers, how hard it is to get them out of bed? So he was in such a hurry to get down to work. He forgot to tie up his horse, and the horse ran off into the mountains. Well, that evening when he trudged home, some of the villagers came walking behind him, and they all ended up standing on the old woman's doorstep saying, old woman, you have such bad luck. Your careless son has let your horse run off, and he's no good working for us without a horse. You have such bad luck." The old woman, who was very wise, she went, "Maybe it's bad, maybe it's good. Who knows for sure?"
For sure.
Well, the next day her son had to walk down to the village to work, and the villagers noticed in the afternoon there was this cloud of dust in the mountains, and it was moving right towards the hill and the old woman's hut. So they were curious, and they went to see what it was. And guess what? It was a whole herd of wild mountain horses that had followed the old woman's horse home. When the villagers saw those horses, they got very excited. Old woman, you have such good luck. Your son can build a corral, and he can break and tame these horses. You can sell them and make lots of money. The old woman, who was very wise, she responded, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. Who knows for sure? Well, her son built the corral, and he was taming these horses, breaking them. And one day he was on the back of one of those great big wild mountain stallions, and the horse bucked so hard, when he fell to the ground, both his legs were broken and one of his arms. Well, you know how bad news travels. In no time at all, the villagers were on the old woman's doorstep saying, old woman, you have such bad luck. Your careless son now, he's laid up. You're going to have to take care of him. You have all these horses to feed. Nobody wants to buy a wild mountain horse. You have such bad luck. The old woman, who was very wise, she said, maybe it's bad, maybe it's good. Who knows for sure? Well, the very next day, the soldiers of the Tsar came to the village, and they came to the old woman's hut, and they conscripted, they carried off every able-bodied man to war. And many of those men were killed. Some came home very, very crippled. But of course, they didn't take the old woman's son. And I say, who knows? Maybe they even bought her horses.
That's wonderful.
So that's part of the beauty of being elderly. You've seen a lot, and you don't need to get so riled about things, you know? They turn, maybe. Things, what you think is a catastrophe may have a lesson or a blessing in it.
Food for thought.
That's fantastic.
Yeah,
And you know, you're such a storyteller. You also wrote a book called A Bridge for Grandma. Tell us a little bit about what that's about as a story.
I was working with some young children. I'm talking about in daycare settings and in lower elementary. And I happened to encounter some children who could not learn because they were traumatized. It had been they had witnessed a murder of their parents, or it had been a sudden accident, and they'd lost someone they loved, and they were, we would call it PTSD, you know, they were just traumatized. So I thought, the teacher needs to have a story, or the counselor, the school counselor. And when I looked, this was back in 2005 and 2006, the stories were about squirrels and dogs and trees and poetry. And I used to teach elementary school, and I know, and I taught preschool too, I know how concrete children are. And I needed something real. So I was at a conference, and I was having dinner with a resuscitation pediatrician who's in Oregon. And I said, you know, his name was Melvin Morse. I said, you know, Melvin, you've written 5 books, but you've never written a book for children. And you're a pediatrician. And he just turned to me, and he put his finger like a gun, and he said, you're going to write the book because you're the storyteller. And he was more like a researcher. So he shared with me the pictures the children had drawn, and I worked with a researcher, PMH Atwater, who had interviewed 177 children who'd had a near-death experience. Either the doctor had brought them back, resuscitated them, or they just came back on their own. And from those, I couldn't use their pictures because their art was very different style, but I went to a mentor publisher so I could pick my artist. And she looked at the pictures, and I summarized the case stories for her, and I wrote a story, because I used to be a reading teacher, you know, with pretty much controlled vocabulary, but that would comfort children so that they would know what these children said happens when we die after they've had a near-death experience. And all the children, it's so beautiful, they said that they go to heaven right away. Someone comes to take them, an angel, and in my book it's the grandpa, that they fly, they talk about flying to heaven, and heaven has rainbows and flowers and trees and butterflies. It's beautiful. But they're all told, and they call it, even though some of them had Muhammad in their pictures, or Jesus, or some Abraham, they all talked about meeting the light, and this loving light tells them they have to go back. So that's in the story, in the book, the little girl comes back, and her parents don't want to hear what happened to her because they don't want to think they might lose her. But Grandpa had met her when she went to heaven. He took her to heaven, and Grandpa had died 3 years before. So Grandma likes to hear the story. And the two of them start a scrapbook of memories because she was so little when Grandpa died. And then the scrapbook evolves to their memories, and it goes through the death of the grandmother. And at the end, the little girl has that scrapbook. And I want to encourage
beautiful.
families to make scrapbooks with their elderly relatives, because the part of the brain that's musical and pictorial lives even when there's Alzheimer's or dementia. If you have a picture, you can tell the story from that picture, and it makes the visit so much nicer, you know, and it makes the children want to be around the elderly when they can tell stories. Yeah.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Years ago, you know, you didn't go around the elderly. You didn't feel comfortable to do that.
Well, even now, if you go to a nursing home, by the time someone gets to a nursing home or assisted living or memory care, you know, they aren't so vital, and there's smells, and you know, people are hunched over, and it can be a little scary for kids.
Well, and scary is the right word for kids, and then I think for their parents, there's emotional pain and even personal fear of, could that be me someday? All those things get in there, and it makes it more difficult. So
if you make a scrapbook, you can gather the person's stories and record them too, as well as write them down, and have pictures. And if they're in plastic, they're pretty impervious if someone spills on it. But to have that with the elderly, and because of dementia, when I've been around older people, they love that book, and they'll tell the same story again and again. Anybody that'll listen, you know, and then they get that response, because everybody likes a story.
Oh, yeah.
So they aren't just, you know, sometimes you go to a senior residence and people are just kind of staring out the window or sitting, they aren't even talking.
Very purposeful kind of project, and you're right, you can revisit that over and over again, and everyone enjoys that.
Yeah,
Well,
you make me think of one of my aunts was in a nursing home in Wisconsin, and we went to, and nobody was visiting her anymore because she didn't know them.
Yes.
So, and I said to them, I want to visit her. So we went, and my husband and I went, and I held her hand, and she didn't take her eyes off me while I talked to her. I knew that she remembered me. But I lived in St. Paul, so I didn't see her very often.
But you
Even
can
that's a
put,
touching
people's
story.
pictures with their names on it too, for them to remember.
Yeah.
You know, they can look at their book. Oh, this is.
Well, we've run out of time, and this has been delightful. And I think, thank you, each of you, for being here and contributing some of your own personal stories
Wonderful
for
stories,
this. And I
thank
think
you.
something that our viewers can take away with them is that if you are an elder in the family, what a wonderful thing to do what you can to develop your own storytelling skills and share some of the things that you know about your life and family members with your family. And thank you again for being here, and thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.